Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin. We have a great show for you this week. As usual, the Third World War marches onwards, and we're here for your weekly update so you don't have to rely on the mainstream, zogged out media to hear about what's really going on in these latter days of ours. So with all of that, we've got big things going on in Armenia, Azerbaijan. That's going to be our big focus. Dmitry, how are you doing this week?
Yeah, doing great, Conrad. And yeah, as always, researching and just watching all the news take place right before our very eyes. Of course, we spoke for a few weeks about how the Middle East was getting slightly, quiet and very calmed down. Perhaps we would finally see peace, but nevertheless, as you just said, the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict has arisen once again, as it has pre-COVID, and finally we're seeing an escalation, unfortunately for the locals living there, because it does not seem like there can be any sort of compromise from either side. It seems like they're really in it both sides are in it to win it. And of course, it's also a big lesson in international relations for either side. Where can the Armenian lobby seek its support? Could it seek it in France, the European Union, or is the Azerbaijani lobby in Israel, in America, in Russia, in Moscow? Is it actually a bit more powerful and influential? So we do see that great tension occurring. Then even more involvement from the actual neighbors of the states. On the side of Armenia, we see Iran, and of course on the side of Azerbaijan we're seeing Turkey. So this massive involvement has really escalated it to the point where, as you said, it does look like another front of the Third World War, and that is not being hyperbolic. That is literally what's taking place right now before our very eyes, even just today as we're recording.
And we're going to get into all the details about that, and then later on in the show, we're going to get into Ukraine news, Kolomoisky's arrest, stuff with Surovikin, Ukraine's new defense minister, all that kind of stuff. A lot of that stuff went down right after we stopped recording last week, so full spectrum of coverage this week. We're going to be talking again about ban the ADL, which exploded even more this week, stuff going on in Israel. A few prophecy things and whatnot. So a jam-packed World War Now episode this week. But let's just dive right on into this Caucasian question and everything going on in that mountainous region right now. It seems that, again, this war has been kind of in a stalemate. There was a major stoppage and ceasefire, in 2020. When the Russian peacekeepers entered the region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But let's be honest, there's been a lot of, skirmishes, a lot of exchanges of fire, a lot of diplomatic bluster. And of course, this coincides with Turkey's just general kind of expansion and movements in all directions outside of its borders. But what triggered this latest kind of form of aggression from Azerbaijan is as they have secured all of the territory around the self-described Republic of Artsakh, or, Nagorno-Karabakh as it's known internationally. What had happened was in the 90s, the Armenian forces had kind of gone into Azerbaijan, taken control of these Armenian majority regions, and even expanded outside, giving themselves a bit of a buffer zone. All those buffers have been taken. It's now entirely this sort of, the city of the areas around the Artsakh Republic and the Lachin corridor and this one highway that connects it to the rest of Armenia. And despite the fact that Azerbaijan has, basically been given this territory, but Armenia has said they're going to recognize this as Azerbaijan, not go any further with it. They do want, the reason there hasn't been fully settled on this is that they want more guarantees for the ethnic Armenian population. But basically the Artsakians, as the people in Nagorno-Karabakh, elected Samvel Shakaramyan as the president of their, breakaway region. And these elections going on at all were extremely offensive to the Azeris. They were not happy. They say this went against the, territorial integrity of Azerbaijan and goes against the constitution as they consider all the Armenians there, Azerbaijani subjects. And since then, we've seen insane amounts of, Azeri equipment sent to the region, sent to the borders. We've seen them painted with Z's and V's and F's. Those have been the three letters I've seen. So I don't know if they're just aping the Russian Special Military Operation letters or if these are just, the most common letters for people to mark their trucks with these days in 21st century warfare. But the Armenians have responded somewhat, but in general, it does seem that, from my perspective, that Pashinyan is really shooting himself diplomatically in the foot in regards to what his country actually needs to defend against this Azerbaijani aggression.
Yeah, I think it's quite noticeable that Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia, was actually the one escalating the situation in the first place. Him sending his wife a few days ago to Kiev actually to meet up with Zelensky really showed, at least the Russian side and the pro-Azerbaijani side, that look, Pashinyan is taking a pro-Western position, and his wife, frankly, gave a lot of pro-Ukrainian speeches in Kiev, frankly accusing the Russian side of bombing Ukrainian children since February 2022, which was very hypocritical considering the Ukrainian military was assaulting the children of Donetsk, Lugansk, the eastern republics, the eastern people for about 8 years prior to that. So it's really confusing as to why exactly he sent her to Kiev and didn't go himself and give a more constructive feedback. Instead, he sends his wife, and she gives this very hyperbolic emotional speech, meets with Mrs. Zelensky, and they both have this have a few photo shoots in front of churches which they recently have occupied and taken from the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So it's a very much a disgusting sort of show of solidarity with the Western powers. And Pashinyan, speaking of Western powers, we do understand that we've spoken about it in a few previous episodes, but Pashinyan's only support in the West seems to be France, of all countries, and France is experiencing a really heated situation in Northwest Africa at the moment. So it's not really focusing on the Armenian front. In fact, diplomatically, yes, they are supporting Armenia and they are providing them weapons, but how much support will France actually show if Azerbaijan escalates the situation as we're seeing them essentially bring their forces to the front lines? And the other question, Conrad, I think is, what are the Russian peacekeeping troops going to be? That how are they going to react to the Azerbaijanis pulling up to the front lines and Armenians essentially aping them and bringing their forces as well into a defensive sort of a position? Because from what we understand, we don't have exact numbers, but there are between 1,000 and 2,000 Russian peacekeeping troops on the borders of Nagorno-Karabakh at the moment. And yeah, we've seen tensions and different kinds of photos and clips from the front lines that as Azerbaijani troops and essentially migrants, people traveling across the border, basically teasing the Russian troops. And there was some local sort of, not skirmishes, but like arguments of sorts, but we haven't really seen this escalate. But now, of course, the Russian troops will either need to withdraw or they'll need to, I suppose, defend the particular goals that they were set out to do, which was peacekeeping. So, and I'm just not sure how they could face a 10,000 plus Azerbaijani army. It's just, it doesn't seem very fair. And Russia at the moment is a little bit too preoccupied in the Ukraine to really send any more reinforcements to the Nagorno-Karabakh. It's a really tense situation here. And it seems like Pashinyan is definitely the one in charge. So it's not like Azerbaijan wanted to escalate the situation. Just to recall, guys, not even a few episodes, but one of the early episodes, maybe episode 5 or 6, when the meeting of the Collective Security Treaty Organization took place in Armenia, Putin was about to sign the agreement, ends up dropping his pen. And that was a big sign of everybody kept on analyzing the drop of Putin's pen in Armenia in November of 2022. They were saying, well, maybe it's a sign that the Collective Security Treaty is, even though it's going to be reviewed, it kind of has come to an end. And Putin's friendship with Pashinyan has in fact ended, at least in late 22. And we've seen that today where Pashinyan just this week gave a few speeches where he openly condemns Russia, says that Russia has betrayed Armenia, betrayed their collective alliance, and in fact, Russia only wants the worst for Armenia, as opposed to, Russia actually having peacekeeping troops on the border, protecting what's left of Armenian sovereignty from the Azeris. So, in fact, I think Pashinyan has made a gigantic blunder, and seeking support from the West and kind of betraying his support for Russia has seen him essentially fall into huge disrepute amongst the former Commonwealth of Independent States. And Russia, Belarus, I just don't see Pashinyan recovering from this. It's very, very sad and unfortunate for the Armenian people.
I don't know if it's the Kardashian influence getting them wanting to be more aligned with the West, but it's really not a good call for them, especially at the reality on the ground. The cultural, geopolitical realities are that Armenia, your allies, are like the anti-Western forces, like Iran, Russia. These are the countries that are your historical, cultural, regional allies, but instead you've decided that you want to be friends with the French and you want to do all these sorts of things. And look, just the past few days, Putin met with Erdogan again, which we were, that was all in flux based on how crazy he had been getting with his statements about Ukraine and NATO and the Black Sea and all these other things. So we're going to get into that as well. But as far as what Armenia is going to do if Azerbaijan moves, I mean, it seems that Iran is their only hope. And I don't know if Russia has told Iran anything behind the scenes, kind of given them a green light to act with impunity, but it seems that the Iranians have moved troops to the border of there's all these regions are so complicated, but Azerbaijan has an exclave called Nakhchivan, which is entirely disconnected from mainland Azerbaijan, separated by Armenia, and then borders, Iran. And basically Iran has said that if Azerbaijan moves on mainland Armenia, like more than just Nagorno-Karabakh, they're gonna take Nakhchivan basically and occupy it, and to protect the Armenians. And this, I mean, Iran, on the one hand, does have border disputes with Azerbaijan. Ultimately, this dispute goes back to, I believe, the 1994 wars, where Iran tried to play like a neutral party, and the Azeris completely, didn't take that and accused them of working with the Armenians, and that bad blood has stuck around ever since, and they've remained. At this point, they're probably Armenia's most loyal ally. Sure, France may claim that out of their disdain for Turkey, and I'd say the Russian troops on the ground would probably still say they are in favor of Armenia, but Iran seems, Shia Iran seems to be Armenia's best friend against their Shia enemy, which is just very interesting to say the least. It shows you how, while it is a clerical religious state, Iran is very much, I don't want to say a slave, but very much beholden to geopolitical and regional realities. And when it comes to Pashinyan, we also remember it was at that CSTO meeting, he basically said that, oh, we're not going to renew the CSTO or whatever in Belarus. I mean, I remember Lukashenko was like, what the hell is this mountain Jew doing? And it was I remember everybody was just so pissed off at this guy who, like, they could tell that, like, most of them were on the same page, generally speaking, as far as the CSTO's perspective on the situation in Ukraine and the unity they had against the Western states, and he's just throwing all of that into flux. And of course, if Armenia had stuck with Russia, that would give Russia even more of a reason to, clamp down on Turkey. They have their own disputes with Turkey and everything going on with NATO, so I don't see why Armenia would seek to just push Russia further in that direction, considering that it's probably not going to help Russia in the long term either, when we know that, as Metropolitan Neophytos and St. Paisios have said, overnight, Russia and Turkey will go from friends to enemies, which is something we're kind of always watching for here on the show. But if you have any details about Putin and Erdogan's meeting, Dimitri, that would be great, because I'm sure, they clash in Syria, Russian and Turkish proxies directly. I'm sure that the presence of the troops in the Lachin corridor and the demilitarized zone with Armenia and Azerbaijan, I'm sure that doesn't not come up, maybe not between Putin and Erdogan himself, but at least between the ministers meeting.
Yeah, so essentially Putin's meeting with Erdogan was, of course, the first show of power that Russia has displayed after its successful, discussion at BRICS. And of course, all these countries would join BRICS, as we discussed prior, but Turkey was not part of that. And Iran was. Notice again, Iran coming out as the winner. And finally, now that Iran will be a future member of the BRICS Economic Coalition, they will be participating actively in the foreign policy of the region as well, because now they have this security that, look, hey, we actually can't be sanctioned to all hell, because we're not only economic allies of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, but also regional powers such as India, China. Iran and Persia definitely have a future now in the region, so they can actively, say, participate in Azerbaijani-Armenian relations and finally seek out their own interests in the region. Not saying that's good or bad, but that's just the reality on the ground. And of course, the meeting between Erdogan and Putin, very, very tense, I would say, in Sochi, and we can even see even Erdogan's attitude. Erdogan, being such an experienced politician, meeting up with another experienced politician, Putin, both of them being hardcore realists, and Erdogan backstabbing Putin for all of 2023, essentially, winning the election, promising to somewhat support Russia or be understanding of the Russian-Ukrainian tensions, has completely sidelined Putin, accepted Sweden, accepted Finland, hasn't supported the grain deal. Now, of course, this was the main crux of the discussion, was that with the reinstatement of the grain deal, somehow assisting Russia and Ukraine in shipping all this grain through Turkey. How can they make it work again? Russia, of course, quitting the grain deal in July was probably the biggest catalyst for its escalation of attacks on Odessa, as well as some of the other great ports. But it does sort of come into question, like, can Putin actually, does he actually have the respect of Erdogan now that all these BRICS countries are coming to the forefront and Turkey isn't part of that? Maybe that was the bargaining chip that Putin used in order to meet Erdogan in person. We all know the guy responsible for this meeting was Abramovich himself, actually being in Sochi 2 weeks prior to this meeting taking place. It seems like Abramovich, we speak about conspiracy theories and dumb boys and things like that, but Abramovich seems to be the literal diplomat of the year in terms of actually getting Turkey and Russia speaking together. And I don't know what kind of strings this man has, whether it's Rothschilds or sort of international bankers or some US connections, I don't know, but he definitely does seem to have his finger in almost every single pie. He is the Kolomoisky of Russia. He is the big godfather behind the scenes, running different ambassadors, embassies, getting people to talk. And it does seem like it's benefiting Russia somewhat if Erdogan and Putin can come to an agreement. And this meeting that they had in Sochi at the end of last week, it didn't, in fact, yield anything. All it was is essentially they just said, look, we're going to seek a compromise. Erdogan said, we're going to try and bring Russia back into the grain deal. We'll formulate something here, and we'll get Ukraine to cooperate as well. Ukraine at the moment isn't showing any signs of cooperation on this end. And in fact, the Iran deal is still sort of dead in its cradle. It hasn't essentially been reinstated. It hasn't been it's not brought back to life. And Russia's in a similar position. And of course, as we mentioned, its agricultural bank is still SWIFT banned. So there are still questions as to exactly how Russia will benefit from the grain deal, unless it gets all some of these bonus removals of sanctions, which it has been seeking since last year. It's also, I think, interesting that Erdogan would essentially meet up with Putin after all these controversial events have taken place in Russia. For example, Prigozhin's coup / Prigozhin's death. There's been a lot of questions as to exactly how strong of a character Putin would appear on the foreign political scale and not visiting South Africa. And in fact, meeting with Erdogan, I think, has reinstated some authority of Putin as a figure in international affairs. You know, him finally meeting with Erdogan, like in person, being like, okay, we can actually talk it out man to man. I think that has a lot of power in foreign policy. So Putin, I think, has come out on top, finally, meeting with his main opponent in that Black Sea region, Erdogan. And I mean, I don't know how Putin could speak with him so frankly without emotion after what Erdogan has done in, inviting Sweden and Finland into NATO, and after all of that whole Quran burning shenanigans with Putin visiting Dagestan, and that entire sequence of events where Putin had to essentially play pro-Muslim in order to try and appease Turkey. What ends up happening, Conrad, is Turkey is not even interested in like Islamic, international affairs whatsoever. It's just completely hyper-realist, and essentially Turkey, all it cares about is actually what benefits the Turkish people first and foremost. And Putin has been like, oh wow, I've just been completely fooled into playing along with this holding the Quran, kissing the Quran game, and it just doesn't bring any sort of benefits. And yeah, now we're finally seeing Putin and Erdogan coming together. I think it's probably a good sign because, again, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict does need a neutral third party, and I don't think Belarus plays that neutral card. Obviously, Belarus being so closely aligned with Russia, and neither does Poland being so closely aligned with Ukraine. So you definitely need that third power if there is any sort of chance for future peace talks. And I think Turkey could be that catalyst. But again, we do have to keep in mind the prophecies, and the prophecies do speak about the fact that Russia and Turkey will go head to head, will fight over a European war of the future. And yeah, so we do have to keep in mind that Erdogan, despite his good relations with Putin right now, even after all the backstabbing, it could get sour very quickly.
And what did Turkey say when the Iranians made their threat on Nakhchivan and just on Azerbaijan in general? They said if Iran moves on Azerbaijan, we will move on them. So I guess if Azerbaijan moves on Armenia at all, that just immediately implicates, I mean, if you include the Russian peacekeepers, immediately 4 other states. So there is a lot at stake here. And again, it's not, I'm seeing people that are always, on betting on nothing ever happens, saying that this is big and there's a lot going on here. And again, it comes at the same time as these huge escalations in Syria, in Deir ez-Zor, where these tribes are taking on the U.S.-backed forces there in like these former ISIS-occupied regions. And again, I don't know how many of these tribes are ISIS. It seems that they're at the very least not going Wahhabist, cutting people's heads off, but it's very much a local, tribal movement that have been, I think they're having Turkish support and are going against all sorts of perceived occupying forces in the region. But as far as Armenia, Azerbaijan goes, it does seem that Aliyev has very much diplomatically outmaneuvered Pashinyan in these past years. And again, if Armenia stops to exist as a state, I mean, again, that really brings in that full pan-Turkish belt. I mean, all the way from Turkey, I mean, even if you want to include parts of the Balkans, all the way from, the Balkans to, to China. That's a, kind of a Turkic civilizational belt. I mean, I don't know how much of a civilization you want to call it, but if people identify in the Turkic capacity, it's pretty continuous. And again, obviously we could see if Russia would get involved, but obviously Russia's tied up in Ukraine, and it does seem that Armenia has really done everything possible to alienate the Russians. So we're going to be watching it very closely. It's so fascinating because, again, think about this. This is a huge conflict brewing, possible World War III catalyst. And remember, Artsakh only has 120,000 people. So this is fundamentally about 120,000 Armenians who, they don't want to live under Azeri rule, obviously, and the Azeris simply can't allow them to, even have their own kind of regional elections or anything. So, in light of everything else going on, here we are. This is what we mean when we say we're living through the Third World War. This wouldn't be as high stakes if this was happening 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. And frankly, we do have to keep in mind just the alliances in that region do bind these countries together in a similar fashion to what they did in, say, prior to the First World War. Unlike the Second World War, where Stalin, for example, had an alliance defense treaty with Yugoslavia, but never upheld it when the Third Reich actually invaded Yugoslavia and allowed Yugoslavia to fall within, was it like 2 or 3 weeks in July 1941. And so it depends again. Will Russia actually stand up to its peacekeepers? Will it actually assist Armenia if things escalate? Despite the fact that, as we've discussed, the majority of Armenians are actually not Eastern Orthodox Christians, but belong to, I suppose, the Armenian Apostolic Church. And in fact, we've looked at the statistics. There are a lot less Armenian Orthodox Christians belonging to the same canonical, of the same canonical status as the Russian Church, for example, in the Greek Church. Than there are in Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan has a great Orthodox Christian population, and if you're going to speak about a country which has more Orthodox Christian presence and even missionary work is more successful, Azerbaijan is that example. And so in terms of church relations, yes, Armenians are Christians and the majority of Azeris are Muslims, but the Eastern Orthodox Church has been incredibly suppressed, maybe you could say, or it hasn't really flourished in the Armenian countryside for whatever reason. There was a really large Armenian diaspora in the past of Eastern Orthodox Christians actually spreading their influence and, of course, missionary work, evangelizing the local Armenian schismatics into returning back to the church, but it hasn't really turned into anything after the Russian Revolution and the funding really stopping from the Imperial Russian side, as well as the Turkish genocide in the region, and what exactly occurred after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. We all know all those atrocities. So Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the region is very heavily, I suppose, displayed, frankly, in Azerbaijan only. And let's not speak about the northern neighbor, Georgia, which is incredibly, like 99% Orthodox, but very pro-Western and very NATO, EU supported. And at the moment, Georgia has really kept quiet, and we're not really going to see them get involved. I think recently they're kind of keeping themselves preoccupied with like local relations and, of course, putting a lot of pressure on the whole Abkhazia, Ossetia situation. So I don't think they're going to get involved in what's exactly happening on their southern borders until a bit later on, I think, which I would say is probably a good thing for the Georgians. I don't think the Georgians should. I think they should focus more on domestic policy and actually fixing their country from the inside, as we said before. That's probably the priority for this really concentrated Orthodox Christian nation, as opposed to getting involved in overseas conflicts with majority Muslim countries. For what exact reason, apart from being like servicemen of the West? There's no real long-term benefit, not even a short-term one. So that's probably where our analysis kind of comes to an end in this region, is exactly if it does break out, there will be a lot of Christian/Muslim tensions, especially if the Azeri troops enter into mainland Armenian territory. We will hear most likely about war crimes of various sorts, missing children, churches being destroyed, similar things to what we hear about in Ukraine at the moment, in Donbass and Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and it won't be a pretty sight. So we hope that the war can be averted in any way. Just because what will occur in the Middle East, as we've seen, Middle Eastern conflicts do get quite heated, and there really isn't, really nobody really holds back, even when the Shias fight the Sunnis, for example, the Iraq-Iran war, which took place over 10 years. I mean, how many Qurans were burned in that conflict, right? When people speak about Quran burnings and them being offensive, how many Qurans did the Iranians and the Iraqis burn during their war? Like, as they bombed the different various houses and military facilities, probably thousands of Qurans. So, I mean, that entire subject should probably be put to an end. But yeah, the entire conflict, if this conflict does escalate, it will be very dire for that particular region.
Well, look, when St. Paisios was talking about World War III and all of these things, what did he say was going to happen afterwards? He talks about there being a Kurdish state, an Armenian state, a lot of these things. And then, of course, a lot of, Turkey, Anatolia, Constantinople being given back to a Greek population once Russia occupies it. So this is, whatever kind of place we're in the time somewhat before the Antichrist, in the aftermath of a Third World War, like a hot, when the bombs really start flying from the big players. It seems that perhaps the state of Armenia will expand, but it does seem that perhaps before that comes, maybe it will stop existing. So we're going to be watching that really closely, praying for peace, obviously. But moving towards Ukraine, news we basically almost kind of missed last week, within like a few hours, really, was they have a new defense minister, and Kolomoisky has been arrested. Dimitri, if you want to kind of brief us on those situations real quick.
Yeah, so the new defense minister of Ukraine, very interesting physiognomy on the man, and of course the old well, let's just begin with saying, of course, these news actually came out at the same time. So very interesting. If you read the early life of both of these characters, it really does point out exactly what's happening in Ukraine. It could seem like an external coup of some sort, but the defense minister of Ukraine, Reznikov, and I'm just paraphrasing Zelensky here, after 500 days serving his country, has been replaced by a new minister of defense. And essentially, Ukraine's minister of defense position is it's essentially the civil position in charge of all the generals and the funding of the military, essentially in charge of all the aid. Yeah, the new minister of defense in Ukraine, of course, Rustem Umerov, very long history in serving Ukraine. Well, by long history, I mean post in the Zelensky government. So he's a Zelensky inside guy. Doesn't really have a very reputable. It doesn't have the reputation of a local minister under Poroshenko or anybody from the old regime. So in fact, him serving Zelensky personally will meet the needs of the modern Ukrainian state in terms of, fund smuggling, sort of assisting the Ukrainian military in just as much as it needs, and then of course hiding the extra stuff that is provided from overseas humanitarian / military aid. Now, what we need to mention is just Reznikov's failure. Of course, Reznikov being used. This is the former minister of Ukraine in defense. The former minister of defense in Ukraine. So he could be, of course, used as a scapegoat now, and Zelensky could, in fact, because a lot of the blame has been falling on Zelensky primarily, as opposed to, say, some of the generals in charge or even the minister of defense. And now Zelensky could perhaps even start up an official investigation and audit, perhaps investigating the minister of defense for corruption. And Reznikov's position in the future of Ukraine is a very questionable one. There are already Ukrainians angrily speaking about how Reznikov actually screwed up the whole summer offensive of Ukraine, and he's actually in charge of it, which is why he was replaced. So this all comes in the wake of, say, official sources claiming close to 30,000 plus, some sources claiming as high as 50,000 Ukrainians dead during this destructive for Ukraine counteroffensive in the summer of 2023. And it does really point to the fact that both sides, both Russia, and we'll speak about Surovikin in a moment, as well as Ukraine, are replacing some of their internal ministers and some of these figures of authority when things do come to tension. Now, of course, let's just speak about things a bit more crudely here. There are some very pretty disgusting clips and videos that have come out about Rustem Umerov, the new defense minister of Ukraine. Now, physiognomy and actual appearance aside, this man has done some pretty disgusting things on the internet, posted videos, clips. It seems that he is some form of sexual degenerate. It's not quite clear exactly what. Maybe he was just on narcotics, but there is some pretty disgusting footage of the now head minister of the Ukrainian defense system. So very questionable. But perhaps maybe because they have blackmail on him, that's why Zelensky actually gave him the promotion in the first place. It does in fact really question, the integrity of the Ukrainian state. But we haven't really spoken about that factor for a while. The Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian state doesn't really have any integrity. So this exact promotion, it doesn't surprise anybody.
Yeah, I mean, the physiognomy is terrible. Just, you might not think he's a Crimean Tatar if you looked at him from a certain angle. But, maybe he's a crypto, who knows. But I think when it comes to this, this comes at the same time as Kolomoisky's arrest, which, we know Kolomoisky was the #1 bankroller of Zelensky. He basically created Zelensky. He not only was his main political supporter, but he also created the show Servant of the People, which, Zelensky took on the character of, the president of Ukraine and then became the president of Ukraine. And, in the show, he's like a candidate for EU membership and all this stuff. And, now look at, it's literally it's not just it's beyond predictive programming. Predictive programming is almost, more ephemeral and ethereal. This is just people have just gotten TV brains. So the only way to get somebody elected on a national platform is to show people them doing that in a funny TV show. People that was just what needed to happen. But he has been arrested, and there's all sorts of theories on why this has happened. Why Zelensky? Maybe people say Zelensky's influence is dwindling. Other people say this is a way to get Kolomoisky out of politics. Other people say, this is just the way the cookie crumbles in the U.S. is really, when we say Zelensky's influence is waning, it means the U.S. is fully cracking down because Kolomoisky, for better or for worse, he is Ukrainian. He's an independent Ukrainian base of power because he's, a billionaire, dual Israeli Ukrainian citizen, and has been a hardcore supporter of some of the most intense Ukrainian nationalism we've seen. So, Dmitry, what are your thoughts and theories?
Yeah, so Kolomoisky has been sentenced to a few years in prison, and essentially even the main penalty given to him was that he essentially is fined $13.5 million in terms of repayment to the Ukrainian state. So they're alleging Kolomoisky was in charge of a massive corruption scheme. Essentially, he was purchasing equipment for Ukraine through some subsidiary companies and overcharging. So essentially, little by little, like dripping funds into his own accounts, and a lot of contracts actually went for him. But we understand that these cases of corruption, probably a lot of the ministers as well as military officials in Ukraine are actually probably have similar crimes behind them. And so this particular small corruption charge of 13.5 million, it really doesn't seem like much considering the hundreds of billions of dollars provided to Ukraine. So the question, as you said, Conrad, it arises: well, is this an escape plan for Kolomoisky? Some people are considering maybe Kolomoisky is retiring from politics in Ukraine, and he is in charge. He was in charge of like the main Jewish community in Dnipropetrovsk. The biggest synagogue, I believe, in all of Europe is actually in Dnipropetrovsk, Kolomoisky's main city, which is very close to Zaporozhye and somewhat close to the front line, you could say. And Kolomoisky is a big character in the entire, like, I guess, a Jewish elite community in Ukraine. And as you said, he was in charge of Zelensky. And there's this other consideration that Kolomoisky would never, of course, turn on his own golem, his Frankenstein's monster, Zelensky. And Zelensky is not in any position to harm his master. So the question arises, probably Kolomoisky actually went along with this corruption investigation, indicted himself, and in fact is willing to go into a cozy prison somewhere in Western Ukraine, with televisions, prostitutes, God knows what these people are into, and would in fact leave, would come out of prison essentially with clean hands and leave Ukrainian politics. That's regardless of if Ukraine wins or loses the war. So perhaps this is a sort of escape plan for him. It's almost like in order to, I guess, alleviate himself from any of the bizarre things occurring on the front lines, or even from the Zelensky campaign. Perhaps it's his personal way of leaving the Ukrainian political sphere of influence without any, burning all the bridges and sort of having no strings attached to any future obligations. Now, of course, he could always go live in Israel after his sentence is over and have like a proper retirement, similar to some of the Russian oligarchs who ended up leaving Russia during the Putin administration. So it does really kind of paint a picture of, well, Ukrainian politics doesn't seem very straightforward, and really it isn't, because we see these powerful people who are even behind the Zelensky campaign early on, and of course will probably assist Zelensky in some way through their subsidiaries, and third parties will assist Zelensky in future election campaigns if Zelensky even makes it that far. But we do have to consider that Ukrainian politics is it's a very gray area, and even some of these people, despite some of their ethnic and monetary allegiances, they don't necessarily always align on the same question. So, like Zelensky firing Reznikov being one of them boys, Kolomoisky, of course, kind of leaving and just saying, look, I don't want to be part of this anymore, going to prison for a few years, having to pay a fine. This is all part of just the plan. And I guess whatever is occurring in Ukraine, we can definitely see it getting worse, and especially some of these major figures leaving the field. It's not like they're going to be replaced with anybody competent. And somebody like Umerov, having almost no reputation of being a civil minister of any success since at least 2019, it's really questionable as to how he can run the Ministry of Ukrainian Defense effectively, right? So somebody with no reputation, he's never served in the military of Ukraine. He's similar to, of course, Shoigu, I would say, but unlike Sergei Koshygotovich Shoigu, Umerov has no history whatsoever. His past is almost completely blank. He's just a Crimean Tatar. And of course, his Crimean Tatar heritage, despite it being under question, it does kind of paint this picture of, well, he's a Crimean Tatar. He could perhaps in the future speak about, the integration of Crimea back into Ukraine, and he can kind of keep that rhetoric up because he's a native Crimean. And let's not mention what the Crimean Tatars did during a Great Patriotic War during World War II, and all the war crimes that occurred over there. But yeah, it does seem like Ukraine is kind of falling apart on the inside, or more or less like corruption does not just crumble your internal affairs, but it also crumbles networking and people's relationships. Like when everybody has blackmail on each other and everybody's corrupt, how far could things really fall apart? And it shows that, well, even the second and third people in charge can be replaced quite easily.
Speaking of Crimean Tatars, everyone should go to listen to my recent interview on the Hervoye Moritz show on TNT Radio. I don't think the video is available. It's still only available as audio. The link is on my Twitter page at GnomeRad. But I was wearing my well-known Phrygian cap on the show, and Hervoye during one of the commercial breaks, pulled out his Crimean Tatar hat. So he's Croatian, and Mexican, but he had the hat, I guess, from some of his travels. He's been in Kazakhstan. We're probably gonna have him on the show next week, so look forward to that. Going to be a great discussion. But yeah, and I have this great image that I captured of us talking in the hat, and I have that as a like a reaction image now. Him in the Crimean Tatar hat. I had some Crimean blank got me acting strange. I've made some memes about it. Not going to complete the sentence. We had this is a family show, right? But the I think it's a good interview. I talk about World War III, my perspective, all sorts of other. He asked me some good questions, so check that out. Maybe we'll have it linked below. But yeah, I mean, with Kolomoisky, I mean, it's definitely kind of the end of an era of Ukrainian politics, regardless of if he's exiting on his own terms or if he really has been, slapped down. It does seem that Ukrainian politics, despite, we know no elections will be happening as long as the war is ongoing. Zelensky will make sure of that. So I'm pretty confident that the next, true shift of power in Ukraine will be some kind of, I don't want to say coup per se, but some kind of, involuntary shakeup by an external force, whether it's the US and some Poles coming in or Russia obviously doing what we know that it's going to probably be doing here in the next few months and making it all the way and forcing a regime change. Because as we said before, I do believe Russia does want Odessa, does want the Black Sea coast, but it really would much rather take those places by the pen and not the sword, as they might say. So we'll see, of course, how that all goes as Ukraine enters a new. Maybe new oligarchs have filled his place behind the scenes. Who knows who has gotten insanely rich on some of this money moving around. So, maybe they just found some new guys and they didn't have to deal with Kolomoisky anymore. But unless you have anything else you want to say about that, we have to talk about Surovikin as his defenses seem to be holding amidst the Ukrainian counteroffensive that has gone effectively nowhere. They still haven't even made it to the first major Russian front lines, the Surovikin lines as they're called. But, speaking of Surovikin, what has become of, General Armageddon?
Yeah, so Surovikin, of course, went missing early in June after his really short clip that he released during the Prigozhin revolt on the 24th of June, 2023. But we remember Surovikin as being the leader of not just the Russian defense line, but also the Russian offensive after the fall of Kherson. So him being in charge of essentially most of the successes seen after the summer of 2022, Surovikin's name and his signature has been on it. And he was in charge of the Russians taking Bakhmut and all the other small, I guess you could say, but memorable successes of the Russian army. And we've all seen Surovikin as a certain positive figure, despite some of his interesting connections in Moscow and other family ties and things like that. But Surovikin has officially been removed from the Russian Ministry of Defense website, so his portrait is no longer there as one of the leaders of the special military operation. And in fact, it does seem like he hasn't been demoted yet from the rank of army general, but he has in fact been ousted, and in fact, you could say officially demoted, and been made I think the head of the anti-air defense of the Commonwealth of Independent States, some really offshoot left, I guess you could say, almost off to the side, fringe. I mean, when have we heard the word Commonwealth of Independent States in the last year and a half? Almost none. I mean, we've heard of Союзное государство, so the Union State of Belarus, so that particular sort of alliance. We've heard of the collective security treaty organization between Armenia, Russia, Belarus, and all the other CIS countries. But the CIS Economic Union, like, what does Surovikin have to do with that at all? He's a military general. He's served several times in Syria. He has a pretty extreme combat experience going back to at least for the entirety of you could say the 21st century. He's perhaps the second most experienced general in the entire Russian army after Gerasimov himself. And in fact, demoting him to such a strange position is almost reminiscent of, you could think of historical figures, like questionable ones, like Nikolai Yezhov, for example, the head of the NKVD under Stalin, who was in charge of a lot of the persecutions and the great purges of the 1930s. And when Stalin demoted him, he was made, so this is the guy who's in charge of the huge KGB, he's demoted and made the People's Commissioner for Water Transport for a few months. And then Stalin ends up executing him as well. So similar to Yezhov, Surovikin, I'm not comparing, of course, Surovikin, who's allegedly an Orthodox Christian, to someone as demonic as Yezhov, but Yezhov was also demoted before he was completely ousted and even executed by Stalin. And perhaps this does point towards Surovikin's future. I'm not going to say it, but if an accident does occur to Surovikin in the next few months or even year, it won't surprise me at all. And I guess the speculation does arise. The Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian government, they haven't provided us an answer as to why Surovikin, this man responsible for the defenses that are holding very successfully in Zaporozhye, they haven't explained why he was demoted, why he was moved away from the special military operations command structure. Was it because of his ties with Prigozhin? Was it because he actually, maybe he shouldn't have, I don't know, maybe he shouldn't have left Kherson, perhaps, or maybe they're blaming him for the Russian retreat out of Izium. We just don't know. And so we're kind of left to speculate on this. And the speculation is they're not quite positive. So or maybe they're just using, again, like I mentioned with Reznikov in the Ukraine, perhaps they're just using Surovikin as a scapegoat and blaming this more or less successful general with some of the losses and the failures of the Russian army in the last 6 to 8 months. And so that's obviously the conclusions we can come to are quite negative. Generally, I don't think this is a positive trend for the Russian military. I'm not sure what kind of changes this could bring, but there's definitely been a shake-up in the Russian military structure, and Gerasimov and Shoigu have shown that they are the absolute. Now that Prigozhin is gone and Surovikin is gone, the Gerasimov and Shoigu, you could say Gerasimov, Shoigu, and Putin triumvirate is reigning supreme over the SMO. Complete power influence. There is no other charismatic figure rising up to challenge them. And yeah, that's exactly what we're seeing at the moment. And speculation could. I'm not sure what kind of thoughts you have, Conrad. We've heard negative ones, such as maybe Surovikin has been getting tortured, maybe he's dead, and in fact, neither of those things would surprise me if he was in fact in charge of the Shoigu rebellion, and if he somehow consented to it or assisted it. I wouldn't be surprised if the FSB did have him in their basements for quite a few weeks, because the photo that appeared from him 5 days ago, we saw the first photograph of Surovikin in a few months, kind of evidencing that he's alive, and he's unshaven, kind of on holidays, walking around with his wife, looking nothing like a general whatsoever. So in fact, he's been away from military service for quite some time, and just really questionable sort of decisions from the Ministry of Defense of Russia, and I'm just wondering where this could all lead.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have any new analysis for anybody besides the fact that, do we all like to think that the Russians are handling this in a magnanimous way, just, giving him this kind of demotion if he really was part of this literal coup? I mean, we're never really going to know any answers to these questions, but, the picture, I wasn't seeing too much body double analysis. At least he seems that he is alive, and he is, he hasn't been humiliated in some huge way besides the demotion. So again, the defenses are holding. It seems that the Ukrainians are trying to make moves in the South Donetsk direction, but it's really not going too well for them. The Russians are making progress, subtle progress in other directions as well. So it really does seem that, short of some extreme reshuffle and in light of what appears to be total mobilization, as far as I could tell, it was real. It seems that countries like Ireland are now sending Ukrainian refugees military summons, basically saying, yeah, we're sending you back to Ukraine, bro. You thought, trust me, bro, we're sending enough money to this war. You're still in Ukraine, basically, man. Like, that's the thing. You go to any of these Western countries, they're all basically parties to this thing. They're going to be like, yeah, bro, get out there, bro. We sent you all these weapons. Go use them.
Yeah, not only that, but just the recent call of across all of Ukraine, essentially propaganda videos, ads being released for the promotion of women actually conscripting themselves and being drafted into the Ukrainian military, as well as just the overall standard falling for people with various mental illnesses, which some of them, mind you, are quite dormant, like, so say, bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder, or even low levels of treatable, you could say treatable schizophrenia, for example, now being allowed to join the Ukrainian military. This is beyond simply hiring members of the alphabet community and transgenders to, of course, fight with the Ukrainians. This is people with categorical, illnesses which need to be treated, but in fact, maybe they should not be included in the military service of Ukraine. These people could get their hands on. They could just have a bit of a tick and, destroy their whole squad, or in fact put their own comrades under. There's just. It's completely, and I'm not even going to mention the fact that the women, it's completely ludicrous how the Ukrainian army is actually beginning to conscript women and promoting the conscription of women, actually signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and joining, being drafted, essentially. I'm not sure if the call to draft women has been put into full effect yet, but the ads are there. So maybe the next step is just to compulsorily to just begin drafting single women between the ages of, 21 and 40, perhaps, which, if women are single at that age in Ukraine, it might be like a real call for them to perhaps leave and go abroad, which a lot of them have been doing already. The calls, people have already analyzed this. As many as 10 million Ukrainians have already fled abroad in the last year and a half, and perhaps the number will increase now that the women are somewhat endangered of fighting completely untrained against the Russian cutthroat military. So it's just, it seems absurd and almost like we're making this news up, Conrad. But the ads are there, and the speech is being given by some of the Ukrainian politicians that the motherland needs to be defended, or whatever they call Ukraine. Не железная Украина, and не железность needs to be protected. So the independence of this Ukrainian degenerate state needs to be now defended by the bodies of not just the young men, but also the young women, the older women, and people with mental deficiencies, which is quite unfortunate and extremely dangerous, which is the Russian army has not resorted to. So even if the Russian army actually brings on a second mobilization or even a third mobilization wave, none of these people, none of the standards will drop as low as they have for Ukraine, which does paint a picture as to which side is more humane and which side actually reflects, any sort of decent, ethical Christian values. And the Ukrainian side definitely does not.
That's not good news for anybody in Ukraine, because I mean, I know any major military, Russia, the US, Ukraine itself, the UK, Germany, Belgium, I think even countries like in India and Bangladesh, these countries have had insane people in the military just snap, kill 5 people on base or whatever. This has happened in Russia, Ukraine, the US just in the past few years. So I can't imagine enlisting, schizophrenics in the time of where your country is about to lose a major war to its neighbor is going to be a recipe for success in any kind of capacity. But unless you have anything else to say about that, we got to talk about, well, actually, real quick, in the midst of all of this, we talk about the defenses holding, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson are having their first regional elections as parts of Russia, not voting to join Russia, but are voting to, they're voting for their local representatives, their local party officials, people that will go to, the state council in their regions. At some point there are already elections for the delegates that ultimately vote for like the regional governor and whatnot. So parties are popping up. There's obviously, I'm sure United Russia has a presence there, but there's other parties as well. Perhaps we'll do an episode just on the local kind of political situation in some of these new Russian regions. But Patrick Lancaster has a good video about all of this. He goes to some of the polling stations in Donetsk. They had to extend the voting period for multiple days because obviously there are certain days when it's really not safe to be going into the center of the city and doing things like that. So due to all the shelling and everything. So with all of that, I kind of want to talk about the, speaking of civilians being assaulted from the air, Elon Musk appears to have, become a participant. With the Starlink stuff, he already was a participant, but in that regard, become even more of an open participant in the war. I have an interesting tie-in with that and the ban the ADL stuff, if you want to fill us in on some of the details with his involvement.
Yeah, so Elon Musk has recently tweeted that he said that, look, there was an emergency request from government authorities. I'm reading the Elon Musk tweet. There was an emergency request from government authorities to activate Starlink all the way to Sevastopol in Crimea. The obvious intent was to sink most of the Russian fleet at anchor in Crimea. If I had to agree with the request, SpaceX would be explicitly complicit in a major act of war and escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. So Elon Musk has just stated that he chose not to use his satellites and some of his technology in support of US, NATO interests as well as Ukraine in destroying the Russian fleet held at anchor in the Black Sea. And people have said, well, look, if Elon Musk did use Starlink and of course the Russian fleet would be destroyed, Russia would activate nuclear weapons. I'm not sure if it would escalate to that extent, but Elon Musk, yes, he is. So Twitter seems to be absolutely at the helm of the conflict, with Elon Musk's satellites being of some level of providing aid not just to the Ukrainian forces, which he did earlier last year, but also of course being almost at the forefront, having almost the chips in his hands that could turn the conflict in some capacity. At least he's claiming, Conrad, that he does have the technology to assist the Ukrainian forces in such a great way, but he doesn't want to be, the magnanimous Elon Musk doesn't want to, of course, assist Zelensky because, Zelensky is a questionable character. So Elon Musk, again, kind of interesting because it does align with the ADL, of course, being a Ukraine supportive organization in general, and, just the ethnic ties there, we could, of course, view them with our own eyes. But Elon Musk really sabotaging the Ukrainian war effort at the same time as pushing this whole ADL story and beginning his lawsuit against the ADL very shortly, I presume. But it's all very, very it's all developing very, very quickly on the Twitter X end.
Yeah, no, I mean, you got to get on X if you're not on there already. It's the only real fun place to be on the internet. I'd say the only fun places on the internet besides, I mean, places like 4chan, they still, you can enjoy your time there, but it's all been so overrun by bots. You have X is finally a bit of a vision into a free speech internet. Rumble, I think they're doing pretty great work over there. You can follow us over there as well. But the YouTube sync is taking really long for some reason, but hopefully it'll catch up, so all of our content will be over there. But when it comes to this ban the ADL thing, I mean, I just got to really congratulate, Keith Woods in particular, of course, Nick Fuentes, John Gage, Sam Parker, some of these other characters. I mean, even Suleiman from the Twitter Spaces with Mario, Khaleesi as well. Both of them have really done a great job bringing awareness to this. I was allowed to speak on one of the earliest spaces before even Mario started doing his spaces. So, I'm not claiming any kind of credit, but I did my part. I tweeted a lot. Me and Dimitri did a lot of tweeting, and I went off in a few Twitter spaces where some pretty influential people were listening. So hopefully I made an impression, made sure to name drop Tsar Nicholas and all of this because, he's a pretty important character when it comes to what these people get up to in the past, especially in the past 100 years. And what's so interesting about all of this was how in all these Twitter spaces, especially the big ones with like 8, 9, 10,000 listeners, was all these random people, these lawyers, they just come out of nowhere to do everything to get the topic away from just what it's about, which is about, Jewish power. And should this Jewish group, the ADL, have the ability to basically financially ruin any institution that they believe gives a platform to speech they don't like? And again, if that speech they don't like you believe happens to be anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, whatever, no one cares. That's not the debate. The debate isn't about do we like anti-Semitism. The debate isn't about does Elon Musk like Jewish people or not. The debate isn't about all of that. But all these people join these spaces and they just derail it to where it's just about anything but what it's actually about. Because what it's actually about is an intangible, I mean, is a tangible reality that people are becoming aware of, which is just the Jewish stifling of free speech for their specific interests. And yes, we know the ADL is a more liberal organization, and all these right-wing Zionists want to tell us that. But look, they are okay with Zionism as well. They don't have a problem with, the super extreme forms of Zionism, frankly. So how about you let the people that are on the receiving end of the censorship talk? You guys sit down and listen. I know people don't like to, the Jewish people are the ones that like to tell us to sit down and listen, but I think it's time for a bit of a reversal there because this is a Christian country, America, and that's where X Corp is headquartered. So that's kind of, and of course this has ramifications for everybody around the world. We know that it's a global thing. The global conversation is kind of happening on there, but so that makes this all the more important that. Again, we have all these people saying like, oh, well, Twitter isn't protected by the First Amendment. It's a private corporation. It's like, we know that. It was a public corporation that had no hope of free speech. Elon Musk took it private as the only way to save free speech on it. And now, because a mafia, the ADL, is holding it hostage for that very purpose, you're going to invoke the Constitution. It's the exact opposite. I should be able to invoke the Constitution and say that a private company, I should be able to say, yes, a private company should be able to do what it wants. AKA Elon Musk should be able to let me say whatever I want about Israel on your platform. That's how it's going to be. And they don't want to accept that. But, the waves were made, the hashtag got suppressed. It hit well over 250,000 posts, multiple huge Twitter spaces. They were shutting down the Twitter spaces. They were capping Twitter spaces. They were doing everything they could. Linda Yaccarino is still posting, some of the most, groveling stuff. She's edited her tweets multiple times. I can't remember if we talked about this last week, but it's just so funny how, what was her name? Vivian Bertovici or whatever her name is, the former Israeli ambassador to the Canadian ambassador to Israel. Keith Woods exposed her as a black cube, Mossad agent live in a space. She joined the space, pretending not to know what the ADL was, despite being followed by Jonathan Greenblatt. It was an amazing moment. Anyone who hasn't seen the clip should go look it up. We'll link it below, but truly a very epic, past 2 weeks, week and a half, however long it's been since it started. For free speech warriors, Christians, white people on the internet, because, I know the ADL has been holding, insane amounts of last minute meetings, all hands on deck. They're not going to present that way, but, Jonathan Greenblatt's been on the air. He's been on all the news things, slandering everybody, slandering Andrew Torba, slandering, trying to. He's been trying to keep it, quote unquote, good optics, though, because he's aware of the lawsuit threat. So now he's making it very clear. Well, we didn't say Elon Musk himself is anti Semitic. We didn't say this, didn't say that. But look, man, you can't pretend that you didn't lead an advertiser boycott that, yes, has led to $22 billion in advertiser revenue lost for Elon Musk. So I hope he sues them. I hope he puts the pedal to the metal. I hope he gets rid of this Linda Yaccarino character and, embraces the American spirit that is, freedom and the ability to criticize anyone and anybody, including, these people. So I think Jonathan Greenblatt, he's probably pretty scared, and the consciousness really is rising. And of course, it was a really good focused message. No one made it too crazy. It didn't suddenly become a debate on the Second World War. It was focused. It was relevant. It was about our time. It was about free speech. And sure, the conversation created a broader space for a general discussion of Jewish power. And I'm not one of those people that was trying to derail it. I know I brought in some history, but this is important. I mean, there was a lot of spaces where we did really wake a lot of people up to the Leo Frank situation. We talked about that last episode. So I think, yeah, really, really a big white pill all around. And frankly, the fact that suddenly in the midst of all this, when Elon is replying to Keith Woods, he's boosting this, 20 plus tweets about ban the ADL situation. Suddenly a huge biography comes out and he's accused of sabotaging the Ukrainian war effort and he loves Russia. This is the kind of thing that suddenly, the ADL and these Jewish groups, they don't play. Now they hit him with stuff that, yeah, now the feds are going to be involved, bro. Like now you're going to be looked at as like a foreign agent. It's like, oh, you wanted to let some people have some Twitter spaces? Boom. We're going to accuse you of treason or something like that. So again, obviously I don't believe not helping Ukraine kill innocent Russians is treason. But you ask some people in the United States government, they basically view Israel and Ukraine as our country, and this, from sea to shining sea over here in North America, we kind of seem like an afterthought sometimes. But what do you think on all that, Dimitri? Do you think ban the ADL? Do you think it's just getting started? What do you think?
I think hopefully Elon Musk does take the lawsuit all the way to whichever American court should be holding this jurisdiction. Considering the damages he'll be seeking and the legal remedies, it'll probably be a very high court, because again he'll be seeking damages in at least the hundreds of millions, if not. I'm not even sure if he'll be seeking remedies of billions of dollars, claiming that's how much damages the ADL has caused to X and to some of his other subsidiary companies. I'm just not sure what the scope of it will be, but definitely the ADL is sweating right now, hiring its lawyers, and the kvetching is definitely ongoing behind closed doors. But just for, I guess, Catholics and Orthodox Christians listening, the ADL has openly, essentially, advocated against Orthodox and Catholic denominations of Christianity very actively over the last few years, specifically attacking the Orthodox liturgy, calling it anti-Semitic, painting Orthodox saints in certain lights, claiming that, look, Orthodox Christians in general are more right-wing, they're more dangerous, just giving us a bad rap, at least in English-speaking countries in the United States, as well as countries such as Canada. Like, they've been very active in the English-speaking sphere. Essentially, if somebody Google, and of course, ADL, because it's favored by the Google algorithm, when you would, type in something like Orthodox Christians, are they extremists? Of course, an ADL website will pop up. And so them actually painting us in a bad light, and painting, not even in a bad light, but simply reframing and reshuffling some of our, I guess you can just say it, elements of our tradition, and aligning them with whatever through rose-colored glasses, whatever viewpoint they have on history, and essentially claiming that we're the ones, we're in charge of whatever atrocities have occurred in the past, we're also complicit in it, and we should be also censored alongside some of the more, I guess, even secular groups in the United States, and we're in fact also somehow complicit in modern you could say essentially cultural pogroms occurring in the United States, which in fact the only viewpoint people like me and Conrad have is that all Jewish people in the United States should honestly and earnestly convert to Orthodox Christianity. They shouldn't remain in their degenerate religion. So that's I think the end position. If that's anti-Semitism, then so be it, because at this point that's the message of the entire Orthodox Church. Anybody belonging to the ADL should of course kind of forego this idea that they have to fight this alleged defamation ongoing of Semitic peoples all over the world, because we do have people actually involved heavily in missionary work in America. But of course, we know missionary work is difficult because in the United States and English-speaking countries, the left-wing ideology, leftism, liberalism is already so powerful. In order to actually fight through that barricade, the last thing we need is an active organization in the background heavily attacking the Orthodox Christian message and claiming that we're some extremists, we shouldn't be joined. In fact, we're not extreme, we're just traditional traditional. We are the traditional version of how reality should be viewed, how history should be viewed. We don't focus entirely on some of these anti-Semitic claims. We don't even have the time, frankly, to defend ourselves against these allegations of anti-Semitism, because it's literally fruitless and pointless. A lot of these allegations of defamation by the ADL towards us, even I can't speak for the Roman Catholics, but we can see people like Nick Fuentes and Joel Davis actually probably do have something to say about their Christian denominations being attacked as well by this organization. So it's demonic, and let's just keep it a buck 50, right? The ADL has been in support of all, not just pro-Jewish groups in English-speaking countries like America, but also just pro-left-wing groups. Like the ADL has given it's almost like it's new Freemasonry, supporting not just hyper enlightenment vision of what the United States should be like. Jonathan Greenblatt and some of these other people in charge of the organization, they don't have a conservative message for America. They have a message of degeneracy, and it's just and like. The second factor is, just besides the leftism, the second factor is, of course, their alignment with the state of Israel, which is completely parasitical, living off the funds of the United States. And we've discussed this heavily over, the last 40 or so episodes. But Israel's control over certain United States institutions is very clear, and ADL is a big part of that. In fact, and this parasitical relationship, the Israeli parasitical relationship to the United States, the ADL is completely in support of it. So, again, that question of this ambassador being a secret agent for Mossad, or these people calling them out, I think it's not surprising whatsoever for us actually being aware of what's happening behind the scenes. It's if anything, I think it's time that major figures such as Elon Musk actually begin calling out these hypocrites openly, and frankly, just cementing this vision that, look, it's okay to speak about this, right, without being banned or somewhere like on Twitter or Facebook, or, I mean, maybe it's a bit too early for Facebook or YouTube, but somewhere like Telegram or X, formerly Twitter. I think it's the right time to non-hypocritically discuss these issues in the open without being deplatformed or without being banned. I think that's the big positive that's come out of this entire hashtag, I believe.
Well, and my friend Popehead, he was speaking in one of the spaces with Mario and all of them, and he mentioned a lot of the ways that, world Jewry has kind of triumphed over Roman Catholicism and its quote-unquote, perceived institutional anti-Semitism. They basically killed the cult of Simon of Trent, one of the blood martyrs, child blood martyrs, much like our own beloved St. Gabriel of Bialystok. They prevented Anne Catherine Emmerich from even being canonized in the church. Her visions inspired The Passion of the Christ and Mel Gibson, and they were just so offended by that movie in general that it would dare to tell the honest facts that, civilizational Jewry is in fact implicated in the death of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ by, the scriptures and the tradition itself. And you're right. I mean, the ADL has spearheaded a movement to change the Paschal hymns in the Orthodox Church, which again implicate civilizational Jewry and the death of our Savior, and laud the Gentile nations for accepting Christ. And the ADL, of course, doesn't want to hear anything about that. And I think it's so important that, again, we've talked a few times about, we had a whole response to public orthodoxy on the Ruski Mir stuff in the past on this show, and we talked about Sarah Riccardi Schwartz and some of these nefarious academic characters. And I think it's just so important to realize that, again, I'm not trying to offend any Catholics here, but to put it not lightly at all, the Jews triumphing over your church at the level of deciding the recognition and glorification of saints, to me sounds a lot like the gates of hell triumphing over your institution, therefore meaning your institution is likely not the true church. And, I don't think we're going to monetize this episode, so I can speak freely here, and I don't say this lightly in the sense that to people like, George Demokopoulos, Aristotle, Papa Nicolau, they've moved for these same points. They've said, it's time to change our Paschal hymns, it's time to change the Holy Week liturgical chanting and the service books because they're anti-Semitic. I just have to say that you're Shabbos Goy race traders and work for Jews, as a certain great man once said on his show. And I think about a certain Matt Walsh, who he's come a long way. So, maybe if Matt Walsh can come out of that, maybe these guys can come around too. But I think it's honestly beyond despicable that these people literally just take up the cause of the literal killers of Jesus Christ. And I guess all I can say to them is that if they don't change their ways, God will spit you out because you are, in fact, very lukewarm. I think that's, like I said, this not going to monetize this one on YouTube. So, thank you, Substack. If you want to support the show, worldwarnow.substack.com, subscribe. These are the type of rants you get behind the paywall. This is, it just shows you that Keith Woods and these guys have done a great job bringing this to the fore because, if the average person is going to be talking about this, then, it's our job to keep pushing the envelope, keep making sure that, the facts go on and the people realize that this isn't just World War III, but you yourself and your civilization that your ancestors gave you, you are at war with, with all sorts of groups of people, but very specifically groups that the ADL represent. Even if whether you like it or not, you may not want to be at war, you may not like it, but sucks to suck, they have a problem with you. So that you better get wise to it. But I think what's really interesting is this all happens in the midst of course, and of course there are Jews that have, Laura Loomer and other groups, really came out against this. This isn't to say there were a lot of great Jewish people online that recognize the danger of the ADL and recognize that the ADL's behavior definitely leads to more anti-Semitism because all it does is, really cement this unfortunate reality that Jews wield a large amount of influence in this country, and it has a negative effect on something like free speech. But this all goes on in the midst of Israel having some of its worst race riots in recent years, with Eritreans rioting in the streets among a few other African groups. And, Israel, they don't mess around. They quickly deployed live ammunition, and Netanyahu's pledged to basically deport all Africans, which all I can say is, in many cases, I wish that we could adopt some of Israel's domestic policies over here in the United States. But of course, the ADL will never be caught calling Israel racist, but instead will be making intense pages dedicated to doxing anybody that associates now with people like Keith Woods or Nick Fuentes or Lucas John Gage or any of these guys. They will be in the headlights, in the sights of these people. But any kind of, basic overt racial supremacy and demographic preservation from the country of Israel will not be noticed by this supposedly anti-racist group.
Yeah, I think the Eritrean story in Israel is completely it's really funny because we do have these Middle Eastern media sites such as Al Jazeera essentially claiming, look, Netanyahu's call to deport Eritreans shows Israel's racism is global. And in fact, a lot of these countries such as, because the Eritrea was celebrating some sort of festival for the first time, somehow the festival broke out into these riots all around the world. And in fact, now 18,000 asylum seekers in Israel, Eritrean asylum seekers, are in Tel Aviv. They started a gigantic riot, and in fact now Netanyahu's first message was a strong one. And in fact, we know the parliament in Israel is very split, so it's very cutthroat politics over there, and Netanyahu needs to show a strong message for his Israeli compatriots, and he just said straight up, look, we're just going to deport these 18,000 refugees. And that's, mind you, refugees are an actual class of people, unlike illegal immigrants or immigrants. We understand that. We know Orthodox Christians were refugees all around the world after the bombings of Yugoslavia and Serbia, after the Russian, the communist takeover of Russia. So we know refugees are real communities. But even some of these Orthodox Christian communities are refugees. Have they ever started riots of some capacity of like this sort when they say emigrated to Turkey or to Western Europe or even countries such as Canada, Australia, United States? No, I don't recall. So it's a different sort of culture, right? Eritreans, they are refugees, asylum seekers. Most of them, mind you, are young men. And of course, Netanyahu won't be tolerating these young Africans starting nonsense in Tel Aviv. And it does show that, look, in the future, when the Antichrist does reign over Israel, and that is his sort of seat of power, and he is crowned the high priest and the monarch, the king of this new Israel, and when Israel does reign over the majority of the world, it will be somewhat right-wing as well. Like there will be of course proper worship of him as the Moshiach. There will be of course right-wing policies, and there will be probably probably kicking people out as well actively. There might even be capital punishment in the Antichrist's future state, which he runs for 3.5 years in the world. So let's not be surprised that Israelis somehow, despite them being like very progressive and left-wing, and them being, for all intents and purposes, somehow aligned to movements such as the ADL and moving this left-wing needle in the wrong direction in the world, Israel still has domestic policies which other countries simply cannot adopt because they'd be labeled as racist. It's like, base policies for me, but not for thee. And Israel continues that particular trend.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic, I wouldn't say I'm an open borders for Israel advocate, but I'd much rather the Eritreans go there instead of come here. But, Eritrea, do they even need to be going anywhere? They have like one of the longest dictatorships in the world. I mean, their country may not be nice to live in, but I think a lot of parts of it are stable. So again, the classic, the classic economic migrant, aka refugee, apparently, depending on the situation. I mean, they are on the periphery of the Ethiopian kind of conflict, and the Tigray. The Eritreans are claiming that all these riots around the world were actually by Ethiopian Tigrayans, just the classic, no, it was them. And, look, I love to stand our Nilotic Eastern African brothers over the Bantu horde, but at the end of the day, Africans are Africans. So it seems that this is how it's going to go sometimes. But we have to move on. We're running low on time. We got to mention a few issues. We want to talk about Strelkov and some of the infighting going on among the Angry Patriots Club. Dimitri, I want you to fill us in on that.
Yeah, just early in September, of course, like on our last episode, actually, a few days before this, so late August, Strelkov out of prison announced that he's running for the presidency of the Russian Federation in late 2024, and everybody thought it was a joke until Pavel Gubaryov exactly a few days ago has mentioned that, look, he will not be working with the Angry Patriots Club in Moscow and Russia, in Petersburg as well, and that he'll in fact be leaving the Angry Patriots Club, or the Patriots Club will be reforming in some massive capacity, and that he won't be working with Igor Strelkov at all in any way in the future, but he still supports him. He still believes Strelkov should be free, and he still believes the Strelkov should actually be given permission to travel to the front lines and fight in the SMO. Pavel Gubaryov essentially, a lot of the people, the supporters of the Angry Patriots Club, sort of Russians, right-wing patriots who don't exactly agree with Putin's vision for Russia, or they see Putin as more or less a really soft version of what Russia should be, and Strelkov supporters, just general oppositionary members of the right wing in Russia. They did not support Pavel Gubaryov at all in this assessment. They said, look, if Strelkov wants to run for president, maybe he should. Maybe we should actually collect signatures, because in Russia, to run for the presidency, you do need to collect several 100,000 official signatures and names and contact details from people in order to actually be eligible to run for the presidency, which is really hard because, yeah, just in general, you can assume some of the just the collective effort and the funding that you need in order to run for the presidency in Russia is extremely difficult to obtain. A lot of even left-wing figures such as Navalny couldn't ever do it, and in fact, Navalny had, besides overseas funding, he had official crowdfunding operations which never really came into fruition in the past years. But someone like Strelkov, this particular call for presidency is very curious. But now that him and Paul Gubaryov have parted sides, it's really unfortunate, because we've seen this before in the right-wing movements in America and other English-speaking countries, where people like, people have fought with Nick Fuentes, Alex Jones has argued with Fuentes. There's all kinds of, the right-wing movements in the past, for example, even the Rodina Party in America, not in America, in Russia, when we had Glaziev's, Andrei Savelyev, and Dmitry Rogozin, later the future head of Roscosmos, who launched these satellites and rocket ships to the moon. These right-wing parties have broken up because of infighting, and in fact we see infighting all over right-wing spaces, not just in America but also in Russia, and it's really unfortunate that it continues to this day. Now we have Pavel Gubaryov, the former head of Novorossiya and the resistance in the Donetsk, Donbass. He's a man of reputation, of really good standing. He has a good family, a loving wife. His wife was again one of the I guess you could say rebels, the unionist movement of Donetsk, actually protecting the Russian people over there from Ukrainian encroachment. He's from a good family, and him now arguing with Strelkov over this particular presidency run is just really unfortunate, because it seems like a non-issue. And I guess what will the future hold for the Russian right-wing movement, at least in this particular area, for the 2024? I'm not too sure. It does seem like quite bleak. And in fact, Pavel Gubaryov does have a large following, about 50,000 people on Telegram. Not as many as Strelkov, closing in on 1 million, but I think we'll find out towards the end of September, once Strelkov is finally released from prison, or at least put on house arrest, exactly what his thoughts are. Perhaps he'll release some videos and he'll speak on it a bit more openly. But infighting in right-wing movements, Conrad, we've seen this too. Like, people just cannot run coalitions and alliances without infighting. And sometimes you can say maybe it's because, left-wing movements and Masonic and maybe even more covert groups infiltrate and they cause infighting. But I think it's a much larger debate and discussion, which we don't really have time for it on this episode. But infighting and right-wing movements, that is the trend across, you could say, the entirety of the 21st century, right? I mean, ever since, I would say, the fall of the USSR.
I would say kind of a big point of this show, I wouldn't say an explicit point, but sort of an implicit point. If this show has any kind of political aspirations, I wouldn't say this is a political movement show. It's two guys talking about the Third World War, right? But it's if it has any kind of political implications, it's that Christianity would be the answer to solve, of course, these issues, specifically Orthodox Christianity, of course, as from a political perspective, in America at least, specifically evangelicalism has proven to be well, it's proven to be politically advantageous, just not for America, just for a different country. So I think in many ways, I think the United States and just Christianity in general, Orthodoxy, again, even in Russia, an Orthodox nation, where in theory everybody involved here is Orthodox. I believe if orthodoxy was even more of the focus, then issues like this wouldn't happen. And that's not to say that someone like Gubarov, again, he's deeper in this than me. I'm not going to say that he might not feel a certain way and felt like something was necessary. But come on, I mean, Shelkov's literally in jail. Do we really need to be stirring the pot more than, even if he is hard to work with, right? Like, do we really need to be stirring the pot more than needs to be done? But if you want to tap the people in a little bit about, do you want to talk about the Greek IDs or Putin at Divyevo first? Because they both kind of tie into the same thing.
Yeah, I think let's just speak about Putin and Divyevo, because Divyevo Monastery, of course, that's where the relics of Saint Seraphim of Sarov lie, and all the other Divyevo saints, including the new martyrs, an entire slew of saints, Saint Pasha of Divyevo, some of the great, even prophetesses, you could say all the nuns. So Divyevo is a women's monastery next to Nizhny Novgorod, just east of Moscow, and it's very famous for having the Divyevo Trench, which we spoke about on I think episode 5 or 6 of World War Now. You can go back and listen to that. Putin essentially walks alongside the trench with the abbess of the monastery and the local bishop and some of his bodyguards. So they walk the trench and the holy ditch blessed by the Mother of God all those years ago, 200 years ago, after the Russian and Napoleonic Wars. And Saint Seraphim of Sarov's monastery, and older Putin again visits visits a very famous holy monastery of Russia, visits the place where, say, which allegedly the Antichrist will not be able to conquer, that particular, move past this trench in the coming eschatological conflict, which, according to Orthodox prophecy and tradition, Divyevo is one of those vanguard points in the world. This like a very holy place that even the forces of the world won't be able to touch in the future. It really points us towards the fact that, look, Putin, despite some of his shortcomings and even maybe strange policies and things which we find questionable, he's still trying to uphold the image of Orthodox Christianity in Russian society, and even inside of himself, even if he's badly catechized or he doesn't understand like orthodoxy as perhaps people who are well catechized should. I think him even appearing at these monasteries and visiting churches, venerating relics, it gives a very uplifting message to the Russian people. So generally, really great that he actually went on this small pilgrimage amidst, meeting with Erdogan and in Sochi and having all these important political meetings. He's still finding the time to actually visit monasteries. It harkens back to, say, the traditions of the early Tsars of the Romanov dynasty, as well as the late Rurikid dynasty, who used to visit monasteries and churches on a weekly basis, and it would be a different monastery every week, and we see Putin kind of holding to that. Or perhaps, I mean, he is up there in age, he's well over 70 now, so it does point towards the fact that maybe it's time to focus more on the spiritual and the spiritual fruits you'll leave behind you, and in fact, funding and organizing programs, rebuilding some of these monasteries, promoting orthodoxy in Russia. Maybe he wants that to be part of his legacy, and his legacy, like Putin, will already go down in the history books, but maybe this particular chapter he's trying to work on as well, which is admirable, despite our position on Putin or some of our personal opinions and gripes of him. This can't be seen as anything other than a positive trend for the future of Russia. And this comes in light of an escalation, I suppose, in the foreign political scene around the world. So it's only good that Putin is still participating actively in the Orthodox life in Russia. I think it's generally positive. Yep.
Yeah, no, I mean, talking about the trench is we've talked about it in a few episodes, and again, Napoleon is talking about Napoleon. He was declared an antichrist by the church. I think in many ways, Napoleon's failure to, conquer the Russian Empire is kind of you could almost call it a foreshadowing of the antichrist's eventual failure to make it past, the trench, when he is, I'm assuming, ruling from Jerusalem. But this ties, this talk, Putin visiting this place, bringing upon this sort of eschatological sentiments, of course, is being felt in Greece as well, as the Greek government weighs, they're planning on implementing the new state IDs that are basically beginning to kind of compile all of the other IDs that you're given into one card, which, Greece has always been for the past few decades, they've been sort of a test case for a lot of these globalist EU measures, as they've been in extreme debt. They've kind of just been forced to be a bit of a laboratory for globalism as they've ingratiated themselves towards the European Union and Brussels and everyone like that. But this is something that many figures in the church have spoken out against. So much so that the Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarch, the Synod of the Church of Greece, felt the need to release a statement saying that this is a state matter. We're going to be looking at lay people's concerns, but people shouldn't freak out about this. They're trying to make there not be too much freaking out. And again, I'm not saying this is necessarily the final ID that St. Paisios. I mean, St. Paisios explicitly says that when they give you an ID that merges all of your bank information, you need to not take this one. And again, obviously, I think I want to wait to hear what. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Metropolitan Neophytos has already talked about this. Again, any Greek-speaking people. I really am hoping for. There's a few Greek people I know, and I feel so annoying hitting them up like, "Hey, what did this say?" And I send them a 25-minute video of a Metropolitan Neophytos talking, and I'm expecting them to like translate the whole thing for me. So if you want to help us out, I always like hearing what he says and what other Greek figures say, as I cannot speak Greek. But I'm going to be looking into what he said because I'm sure he's addressed this. But yeah, I mean, a lot of figures in the church, definitely people of Mount Athos, will have things to say about this. And at this point, it seems that, in the midst of the war in Ukraine and the schism and everything, a lot of the people in Greece and on Cyprus, or some of them, are getting very tired of what I would consider like the stalwart representatives of the lineage of the saints, their stubbornness in the face of kind of just the worldly things. Like, come on, man, just support Ukraine and get the ID and take the vaccine and just celebrate with the schismatics. It's just like, the Chad, no, sometimes that's just too much for them.
Yeah, of course, Archbishop Yerinium of Athens, as well as his synod, exactly how much trust would somebody like myself, who's a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, have for a person who has supported the schism and who has communed and even co-served with straight up schismatics? I mean, I would personally doubt the legitimacy of his decision to not really worry about this particular ID system, especially if Greece is so heavily integrated now with the EU, NATO, being monetary slaves to the IMF and all these other institutions. And this is, of course, another yoke and burden upon the Greek people. Do they really, now that Greek is completely indebted, do they really want all of their IDs digitally available for the New World Order to assess? Like, it's like, do they really want this sword of Damocles hanging over them? I would say probably not. If anything, you'd want to be more decentralized at a time where your country would most likely need to go through essentially a national bankruptcy and a default of sorts in the future. I think if Greece will need to reformat, there'll definitely be a huge down, and then essentially this economic calamity will then take place, and then of course Greece will probably rise up from the ashes, as it always has throughout history. But nevertheless, I'm somewhat doubtful of the legitimacy of this decision to really not worry about these IDs and to be very vigilant. I mean, I agree with the vigilancy part, and again, maybe they're trying to not to stoke fears and panic amongst the Greek public too, Conrad. But let's be considerate. Like, after this COVID vaccine, after the Greek promotion of the Pfizer vaccine and these other AstraZeneca or whatever was popular in Greece at the time, it does seem like the trust of the people is really not with some of these mainstream bishops, and I will doubt very heavily that them co-serving with schismatics doesn't help, but I would doubt they're flirting with the Freemasons in Athens to be any sort of bring any sort of positive fruits for, I don't know, the future of the Greek nation. Frankly, if anything, again, it's hard for us to speak about it because, look, we're all from different countries here. Well, neither me nor Conrad live in Greece, so it's hard for us to condescendingly tell the Greek people what to do in this particular situation. All we can do is report on the news and give our opinions. But frankly, the Greek people have their own multi-thousand-year history going back to the apostles, right? The early apostles themselves, Christ's apostolic descendants were in Greece itself. Greece has some of the earliest Christian collection of saints going all the way back. The Greek people could, I think, they're grown up already. They can decide for themselves how to fix these situations. I think we're simply observing their successes and failures from abroad and commenting on them. I don't think Greece should, again, rehashing last week's point, Greece shouldn't depend on Russia or Bulgaria or Serbia coming from abroad and saving them. I think the Greek people are grown up enough to realize what's happening internally and to seek reformation from the inside and kind of bring this to the bishop. Say, look, Father, these Athonite monks do not agree with me. Here, have a look at these prophecies of St. Paisios. They're very credible verbal prophecies. What do you think about that? It shouldn't be seen as cringe. These things should be brought forward to your pastors, to your the heads of your diocese, and openly spoken about. I don't think there should be any fear of condemnation on the end of the Greek people. So it is very much in the hands of the Greek people where they wish to take this issue. If they're going to riot and say protest openly about it and riot in a peaceful way, I mean, naturally not in some BLM-like fashion in America. We're not going to behave like some sort of animals. We are Christians here. So if the
Greeks may be black, but not like that. Not like that.
the Greek people need to uphold their own beliefs and ideas about what's happening in their own country openly and outwardly as well. There is no babysitting. No other Orthodox country is as old as Greece. So nobody will come to save you. I think that's what the Greek people really need to ascertain here. There is no help from abroad at the point. Everybody else is busy. You guys need to, and I think they are. I think they do understand that, which is why every time there's like a potential gay parade happening in Athens, there's always a semi-pogrom waiting around the corner. I think the Greek people do understand that. So, I'm only thinking that the bishops also know that that's a trend in society. There is this really large conservative group always hiding there with like sticks and things like that, waiting to go out on the streets and protest actively against such measures by the government, especially these Masonic measures like IDs. I'm definitely hopeful.
Yeah, I just want to read some of the things. In 2016, there was a big protest from Athenites and clergy and all sorts of lay people, even scientists and whatnot, against, the coming introduction of like a citizen's card, one of the earlier renditions of this, continued amalgamation of all the cards into one kind of global ID. And what was it? The Holy Kenote of Mount Athos, the entire representative of all the monasteries. They sent a letter to Georgios Katrougalos, who was the Minister of Administrative Reform at the time in Greece. They said, in the view of the Holy Kenote, the new electronic passport, which is being introduced under the pretext of the struggle with bureaucracy and the economic crisis, will pose a threat to the inviolability of personal data and will lead to violation of personal rights and freedoms. We ask you to take into consideration that the electronic citizens card is an outrage upon the human dignity of citizens, reducing them to mere numbers in the system of the state administration. Thus, the God-given freedom of human personality will be violated. This was said by basically a unified statement of all of the Athenite monasteries. And, they took the streets, and there are all sorts of epic signs, and, the clergy were holding up icons and everything. And I think in the next few days we may see something about this in the midst of the latest decision. Obviously, it seems that the Synod in general may be less tolerant of some of this stuff than it was back in 2016, but we'll be watching what Metropolitan Neophytos, what, some of these other figures, what Savas Achilleos or some of these other Athenite figures may have to say. But in general, yeah, I mean, we love I was joking, of course, about, Greeks being black. We love Greece. I love Greeks. They're some of my favorite people. Again, we want more Greek people helping out on this show because we want to interview more Greeks and talk to more of them. So if you're Greek and listening to this, be sure to reach out. We want to talk to you. We want to talk to people because, there's one thing as well about Greek people is so many of, especially the ones that are involved in the church, they're well connected. They talk, they love their relationships with bishops and monks and stuff. So whenever I meet a Greek person that is passionate about the church, I love to pick their brain because, the ones that are serious, they do take it very seriously.
Yeah, that's right. I think, and, Greece does give us this primal example of, when people say the people of Greece are very ethnocentric and things like that. And, they are, it's not even that. It's the fact that their culture has been almost crafted and redesigned by the teachings of the apostles in the church from the beginning of the you can say the New Testament period. So in fact, the Greek people do not see themselves separate from Christianity, and even these creations of the 20th and 21st century where they try to create a secular idea of Greek culture. And even you visit a Greek restaurant and you eat an olive, and that's somehow a throwback to Athens and Sparta. The Greeks still have that, but it's so deeply merged with Orthodoxy. It's simply it cannot be disconnected. I think the only other country similar would probably be Bulgarian culture, of course, being greatly destroyed by the Ottomans. So in fact, it's very heavily damaged. But I would say Georgians, Serbians, and Russians definitely. Russians are somewhat like test tube babies in a way. They are somewhat created in. There's no Russia without Orthodoxy. In fact, so Greece perhaps does have that ancient pre-Christian history which it can still touch upon. But in fact, Greece is this really prime example. And even I would say, speaking of blacks, like Greece is an example, and the Alexandrian Church has shown this throughout the 20th century. Greece is an example for black countries as well, where each country could have its national culture and alongside Orthodoxy merge the two and in fact push their culture into the future. They're distinct, particular, like Greece is a small country, but notice it hasn't merged over the years with either the Turks, which, the Ottoman occupation, or the Slavs in the north. It kind of held its own. And for a country like for a large country continent such as Africa with distinct tribes and ethnicities, this could be the model. And, when we speak about Burkina Faso or Mali and even Nigeria and Niger, Orthodoxy is what could assist them in keeping their distinctness, as well as help them form perhaps a larger confederacy state where each ethnicity and culture will be especially Christianized, and I don't know how to say it, like a culture could be catechized in some way, right? And sort of baptized into the Orthodox Church, and sort of Orthodoxy does still promote national distinctness, which I think Africans will embrace in the future. This is without a doubt. The countries of Asia will embrace. We see this in Japan very actively, and Greece is the foremost example of this, which is why Western Christians, by Western Christian, I mean mostly Protestants, use this as an example against Orthodoxy. Say, well, Orthodoxy is too ethnocentric. It's like, well, no, not really. In fact, all humans are attached to some ethnicity or tribe or nationality. There is no human who is simply cosmopolitan. Even monks on Mount Athos are either Russian, Greek, Serbian. I would say something like a vague notion of a cosmopolitan nationalism simply doesn't exist. And that's the lesson I think the Greek people move forward, is that, look, we are Greek, but we're at the same time Orthodox, and these two identities they're not in a dialectic tension, what you could say from a Marxist end. There is none of this false dialectical tension between the two. So that's something I think to consider, and that's a great perk I think for the Greek people, is that they always have this Orthodox, you could say Orthodox baggage or Orthodox foundation in the back, which will always be present despite how badly the country may fall culturally or even collectively. That they can always return to the church because the presence is always there.
Yeah, I mean, we love Greece. I really want to go to Greece someday. And yeah, I mean, we're kind of running out of time here. Obviously, I'll do the plugs and everything. I wanted to talk about I don't know if we mentioned on the last show. I think this happened in the past few days, not a week ago, but we super chatted Jackson Hinkle on Fresh and Fit, and he did not take it well. And I think we're gonna keep pushing some of these MAGA communists. Haas was spurging out on he had a call-in show and he was muting everybody and completely spurging. He wasn't able to handle the pressing on the JQ and other issues. So maybe this week we'll do a Twitter space or a live stream kind of talking about all this, because we've kind of been involved in all this discourse relatively heavily, despite Jackson Hinkle insisting, oh, Orthodox canonist, I don't know who that is, but follow us on Twitter at World War Now. You'll keep up with all of this stuff. But with all that being said, worldwarnow.substack.com, that's where you can find us for everything. Go there to support us, get access to all the Ether Hour episodes. When you pay $7 a month, get behind the paywall, you get all those Ether Hours where we go off, we don't censor, we just say whatever's on the mind, and it's really good stuff, as well as some really in-depth historical, mythological analysis. Some of the stuff I mean, as far as me and Dimitri could tell, there's really nothing like it anywhere else on the internet. And of course, when you support us in that way, you help us with these episodes. These ones may be public, but that doesn't mean they don't take a lot of work. So when you support us to get that paywall, just know that you're also allowing these episodes to be longer, more well-researched and everything. So it goes towards everything. And World War Now _ on Twitter. Like I said, follow us. Follow Dimitri at Orthodox Canonist, Canonist. Follow me at GnomeRad. Be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. We've been growing on there, posting a lot of good stuff. Follow us on Rumble, World War Now. Follow us and subscribe on YouTube. World War Now, like the video, share, comment, really helps us on the YouTube algorithm. We're getting close to 3,000 subs, so boost us there. If you know people that haven't subscribed yet, send us to them. Maybe we'll shout out our 3,000th subscriber or something, who knows. But with all of that, Dimitri, send us off.
Yeah, thank you to everybody listening, be you Christian, Muslim, from of course an Orthodox background, which we always welcome, or anybody interested in Orthodox Christianity. Definitely worth visiting your local church. Google what's the local Orthodox church next to you. Speak to the priest, of course, Saturday night or Sunday morning. Stay after church, of course, speak to your local pastor. Thank you for all the clergy supporting us, anybody listening. We apologize if we've, of course, triggered anybody very heavily, or if we've used, inappropriate language, perhaps. I think we do get a bit unhinged at times, only because we're so passionate about the subjects that we speak about. And I think just a final message for this week is just #ban the ADL.
So true.